strengths and its own language. But if we're being honest, the ones that get the most eyes on them have always been the visual ones, the television, the film, the formats, where you're not really expected to meet the story halfway. As long as you have some sort of basic level of media literacy, you can just sit there and let the story play out in front of you. And because of that, visual media has always been the final step for anything that wants to become truly mainstream.
That's facts.
Not that books or comics can't be massive. There are obvious exceptions like The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, but even those have had a ceiling, a very high ceiling, mind you, but still a ceiling. And once something starts getting close to that limit, that's usually when Hollywood steps in and goes, they see the cultural potential and, more importantly, the financial potential, and decides to give that little bit of the wee extra push, that little adrenaline boost into the arm, because the goal isn't just to be popular anymore, it is to become unavoidable in every conversation, in ads, in merchandise, everywhere you look. A multi-million, sometimes even a billion-dollar franchise that sits right in front of everyone, whether they like it or not. And the way you get there is through adaptation. Now, when it comes to adaptations, they're almost never one-to-one. Sometimes that is a creative decision, changing things because you think you can improve upon them. Other times, it's not even up to the creatives themselves, they're working within constraints. Runtime limits, studio notes, rating boards, all the invisible walls that come with making something for a wider audience. But every now and then, when everything lines up, when there's enough time, enough care, and maybe even enough input from the original creator, you get something really special. An adaptation that just doesn't recreate the story, but refines it, a second draft that reaches more people and somehow comes out better on the other side. That is the ideal, but the reality is that most adaptations probably didn't need to happen, and when they do, they have to justify themselves because sometimes it's okay to leave things where it is. Not everything needs to be translated into something else, not everything needs to be expanded.
That shit was so bad. Oh my goodness.
I don't think, personally, we needed an Uncharted movie. I do not think we needed a Cuphead show, but if you're going to do it, then prove it. Show to me and everyone else why this version exists. Don't just sand it down for a wider audience and still end up with something worse. And the funny thing is, even bad adaptations can still be decent or even good pieces of media on their own.
Yeah.
You can walk away thinking that wasn't terrible while also knowing it completely missed the point. You can think that it's even really good even though not everything is perfectly or well translated.
That's
but
facts.
then there is another category entirely, because sometimes the issue isn't that an adaptation is bad, it's that the thing you're trying to adapt was never built to survive the process in the first place. And that has been on my mind a lot recently, especially with everything surrounding The Punisher and the reaction to the One Last Kill special, the mix of backlash and defense. It's been interesting, I guess, to watch, but more than anything, it made me start thinking about something else. That some of these characters I really like might not ever get a proper adaptation. Not because studios don't understand them, but because adapting them properly would create a problem. A real one. What's up guys, it's Nate, and it's been a minute. Exam season has been doing a number on me, that's for sure, so prayers up to everyone finishing up right now. But getting back to it, when we talk about characters being unadaptable, there are usually two things you have to keep in mind. The first one is whether the idea itself is tied to the medium. Some stories are built in a way that just doesn't translate cleanly. Games like Portal, for example, where the entire experience, interaction, or something like Watchmen, which just isn't telling a story, it's using the structure of comics itself to say something about superheroes. That kind of thing can be adapted, sure, but you can lose something in translation unless you're very intentional about how you do it. And honestly, side tangent, that's where animation should be doing the heavy lifting, because if we were getting more projects on the level of X-Men 97, I genuinely think there'd be a lot more of these stories that would land in the way that they're supposed to, and a lot more of them would be direct or loose adaptations that work on a fundamental level. Instead, we keep getting live-action versions that are fundamentally the same idea, just flattened out a bit to fit the format. But most of the time, that isn't even the real issue. The real issue is content. It is what the character represents, what they do, what the story requires you to show, or at the very least, not shy away from. And whether a studio is actually willing to commit to that without pulling back at the last second, I don't know. That is where characters like the Punisher, I think, start to fall apart, because the MCU's version of Frank Castle is one of the clearest examples of being so close, yet somehow so far away. John Bernthal.
You gotta think. You gotta think though. Like, I feel like the best adaptation was the one that I grew up on. Was when they had the Russian nigga and they had him folks. I feel like that was the best iteration, because I feel like that was the most gory, the most like let's not act like Punisher ain't known for laying belt. Like, folks lay belt, he lay real belt. Like, we can't skip past that, and we can't act like that's not one of his main strong suits. Is that belt he lay? So I don't know. I feel like it's MCU, man. Fucking a bad thing, folks.
John Bernthal is great. He absolutely has the presence to pull it off, but the character itself always feels like it's being adjusted just enough to make him a bit more palatable. We can't fully lean into the idea that this is a man who isn't sane, that he doesn't just kill because he has to, but because on some level, he likes it. So instead, there always has to be a justification, a sympathetic angle, something that keeps the audience firmly on his side, even in moments where they should probably feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially in the comics. And to be fair, some of that works. His conversations with Matt is easily some of the best part of his appearances. Even in the first season of Born Again, that was my favorite scene of that season. But even then, it felt like setup for something else when he was talking to Matt about his children and how they're whispering in his ear to kill every criminal he sees. Yes, that's really good dialogue, but it's a version of Frank who doesn't actually have it in him to keep doing this forever, which is where the disconnect starts. Because in the comics, there is no retirement plan. Just like Batman isn't meant to like throw up and hang up the cowl, Frank isn't built for a peaceful ending either. He traded one war for another. That is the whole point. But in these adaptations, we keep seeing the same loop. He tries to leave, something pulls him back in, usually tied to family, either directly or through some stand-in, and while that is a smart way to make him more relatable, tying him to family, it also slowly turns him into something else entirely, closer to a Wolverine type of figure, and what gets lost in that process is what makes him interesting in the first place. Because Frank Castle doesn't kill to make the world a better place, that is not his first instinct. His first instinct is much simpler. He hates them. He hates bad people. That's it. He hates evil. And when he decides somebody fits that category, there are no second chances and no hesitation. There's a story where he comes across a kid who's already a serial killer, and instead of trying to save him and bring him in, he just kills him. No speech, no build-up. It's actually a passing thought that he says as he's on his way to his mission. That makes it somehow worse. But at the same time, that's not all he is. This is someone who, before everything fell apart, was willing to carry that darkness quietly in him if it meant he could live a normal life with his family. His time in Vietnam didn't create something new, it revealed something that was already there, that he is actually very comfortable with the violence, and he hated that part of himself enough to keep it buried. That tension became the man he could have been, and the man he became. He was very idealistic, or a little bit idealistic back in the day when he was fighting the war. He had a very insane, crazy smile on his face and very grotesque and creative ways of killing his enemies in the Vietnam War. But that was really just the devil on his shoulder. In fact, I would say in the war itself, he looked like he was a hellspawn, but he still, of course, had some morals. He realized that what America is doing is wrong, they're hurting people, that his existence, him being deployed down there with his people, has led to a lot more problems than he was willing to admit at first. That the promises that America had to the Vietnamese was completely broken the moment that he stepped foot in the country. That is interesting. That is where the character really lives, the tension behind the eyes. And that's the version that's the hardest to adapt, because he loses all of that once his family dies. That part of humanity is now gone. That is hard, because once you fully commit to it, you're not really making a traditional superhero story anymore. You're making something a lot less comfortable and desirable, and once you cross that line, it becomes a lot harder to sell. And can we take a second, just a little second, just to complain about the Superman audience screenings, because you're telling me that you guys hated seeing Crypto get hit in the face, a super dog, by another metahuman, that they had to cut it out. Like, what are we talking about? If this is what gets audiences mad, that's how you know they can't adapt the Punisher, bro. That is impossible. Because now you're
Shit too soft, bro.
not just asking an audience to follow a violent character, you're asking them to sit with somebody who doesn't know how to operate on the same moral framework as everybody else. And that's usually when studios start to pull back. If they can't handle a dog getting punched in the face, a Superman level dog, then what are they gonna do with the Punisher, a character that's meant to front a whole series or even a movie about mature subject matter that has never been done before? It would be impossible. But if Punisher is difficult to get right because of what he represents, Deathstroke certainly is difficult because of what he's done, because Slade Wilson, at least in the mainstream, has been reduced to something that is a lot cleaner than what he actually is. The cool assassin, the guy with the sword, the guns, the tactical gear, someone who can go toe-to-toe with the best fighters in the DC universe and walk away from it. And sure, that version is marketable. It fits neatly into the kind of characters audiences already understand. But that is not the full picture. At his best, Deathstroke is one of the most complicated characters that DC has, not because he's secretly a good person, but because he's a walking contradiction, a man who claims he has a code, who talks about honor and professionalism, but will abandon all of that the moment it stops benefiting him. A master manipulator who can justify almost anything to himself if it means staying in control of the situation. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable, because you can't really talk about Deathstroke honestly without acknowledging the parts of his history that people would rather ignore. His relationship with Tara isn't just some random detail a writer threw in there later, it's baked into one of the most important stories, honestly, without acknowledging the parts of his history that people would rather ignore. His relationship with Tara isn't just some random detail a writer threw in there.
Ain't that a little girl?
Later, it's baked into one of the most important stories and made by his creators. It's supposed to make you question him. It's supposed to make you take a step back and realize that this isn't just a cool anti-hero-like character that you can root for without thinking. And that's exactly why it never makes it onto the full screen, because once you include that side of him, the entire perception of the character changes. You can't market him in the same way, you can't package him as this edgy fan favorite character without also dealing with the fact that he's deeply manipulative, hypocritical, and at times just a genuinely terrible person. I won't go as far to say that he is a PDF file, because there's a lot more to understand with that to unpack, and of course, the definition itself doesn't exactly align with Slade, but he's just somebody who will do anything to get the job done. That's what makes him very pathetic, but very interesting to watch. That is the point. Christopher Priest's run, for example, leans into that all the way. It is a seminal run on the character, and if you read that book, you'll end up loving this character, you'll understand him, and at times, a lot of the time, you will hate his guts. Showing a version of Slade who is constantly shifting depending on what he needs in the moment. One second, he's mentoring, the next, he's tearing someone down just to see how they would react. He'll go out of his way to protect children in one story, and then turn around and have a very violent rivalry with a team of teenagers. Like, how does this make sense, right? He's the worst kind of hypocrite, the kind that genuinely believes that he's in the right a lot of the time. And that unpredictability, that's the part you lose in an adaptation, because you can't really have a character who, in one moment, kills a girl's dog to test her resolve and see what she's made of, a metahuman, and in the next, tries to recruit her by playing on her Christianity and her faith, speaking about mercy and what comes from the Bible in the smoothest, most manipulative way possible, and calling her easy because of her religion, and expect that to land with a general audience without serious pushback. He will sleep with his son's fiancée just to see if she was an actual spy trying to take advantage of his son. That is the craziest thing ever that I've seen. Every time you flip pages in Deathstroke books, specifically by Priest and a lot of the greater Deathstroke writers, you just don't know what's going to happen. So, instead, because a lot of audiences can't handle that, it gets simplified. And once that happens, you're not really adapting Deathstroke anymore. You're just filling a role that other characters already do better. You can get somebody like Deadshot, a character who is really cool, has a good look, a good gimmick, a lot of skills, and is already a scumbag, and it would fit the role better. And you could adapt him without there being any sort of problematic discourse. That same problem shows up in a completely different way when you look at somebody like Venom, because Venom isn't unadaptable in the same way as Punisher or Deathstroke, but he sits in this weird middle ground where every version gets something right and something else completely wrong. Part of the issue is that Venom doesn't have a single clean identity. In the comics, he starts off as a straight-up villain, a genuinely terrifying presence tied directly to Spider-Man, but over time he evolves into something else, a kind of anti-hero with a bizarre personality split between Eddie Brock and the symbiote itself. And that version, that one that's dangerous but also weirdly charismatic, is the one people fell in love with. The problem is, that version takes time. You need the build-up, you need Eddie as a person before the symbiote. You need his relationship with Peter, that obsession, that resentment. That's what gives Venom his edge, and films rarely have that patience. So what ends up happening is that you either rush the arc, or
I don't feel like it's not films that don't have that patience. The audience don't have that patience. Like, ain't nobody trying to sit and watch that shit, bro.
you skip parts entirely. Spider-Man 3 tried to include him but didn't really give him space to breathe. And on top of that, he wasn't even a character the director wanted to use in the first place. But then the Sony films go in the opposite direction because they lean into the fun, chaotic side of Venom, which works on its own, but now he's disconnected completely from Spider-Man. And without that central relationship, something feels off. Because Venom, at its core, is someone who's supposed to be a reflection of Spider-Man, a twisted mirror, and when you remove that, you're left with something that still works as entertainment, but doesn't fully capture what made the character stick around for decades. Even the symbiote itself gets simplified. In the comics, it's not just a mindless monster, it's obsessive, almost emotional in a very strange way.
We have work to do.
The Devil Wears Prada 2 is taking over Disney Plus and Hulu.
Almost emotional in a very strange way, but on screen, the nuance is hard to convey without it just coming across as a generic creature, so it gets reduced, made either goofier or more monstrous, depending on the version. And at that point, Venom, it's not that he can't be adapted, it's that every adaptation has to choose what version of him they want to sacrifice, which is a very different kind of problem, but a problem nonetheless. And then you have characters like John Constantine, who don't really fit the system at all, because unlike most DC heroes, Constantine isn't somebody who goes out of their way to save the day.
The crazy thing is, I feel like a Constantine film would be so cold. Like, bring in Keanu Reeves, gang, and just like folks, get some good writers. Damn, they get the writers who wrote all the good movies, all the good books. All the good comics and books. Bring their ass in together, folks. Get their ass on that movie. I promise you, that motherfucker gonna be joking.
He's not built like that. He's self-serving, manipulative, and constantly walking a line where he's helping people just enough to keep things from completely falling apart, but rarely because it's the right thing to do. He's a nominal hero at best, I'm pretty sure that's how you say it, and that's what makes him interesting, but also what makes him difficult to adapt. General audiences themselves are used to a certain type of protagonist. Even when they're flawed, there's usually a clear sense that they're trying to do good. Constantine doesn't always give you that. Half the time, it feels like he's just trying to survive whatever situations he's dragged himself into, and if you're close to him, you're basically cooked. Being his friend is less of a relationship and more of a countdown. At any moment, something supernatural could catch you tripping, slipping, you'll be caught lacking, because his entire existence is tied to things that are way bigger and way worse than him himself. He's cursed in almost every sense of the word, so when adaptations come around, they smooth that out. They turn him into somebody who's more of a traditional hero, somebody who actively seeks out threats and stops them, rather than somebody who gets pulled into chaos and barely manages to navigate his way through it, which makes him more accessible, but a lot less accurate. Constantine wasn't originally built for the same world as Batman or Superman. Technically, he was with them, but he comes from a more Vertigo-style landscape. The Vertigo imprint was more based on supernatural stuff, based on a lot more gritty, dark things that don't fit within that superhero archetype. He had people like Swamp Thing, the Sandman, of course, the Endless Family, Lucifer, Shade the Changing Man, Animal Man, the Doom Patrol. All of those guys were a part of that mythology, a space that allowed for darker, stranger stories that didn't need to follow the same rules. Once you bring him fully into the main DC universe, especially into live action, you're already adjusting him just to make him fit. Then there's Lobo, who might actually be the closest thing to genuinely unadaptable, because with Lobo, it's not just one issue, it's everything at once. He's excessively violent, not in a stylized, you can cut away from this kind of way, but in a way that's meant to be over the top, uncomfortable, and sometimes just straight up ridiculous. The kind of violence that doesn't really translate unless you fully commit to it, which most studios will not do. And even beyond that, what is Lobo really? He's not a hero, he's barely an anti-hero, and the only real loyalty he has is to his contract, and for whatever reason, space dolphins. That's it. Everything else is negotiable. There have been toned down versions of him, like in animated shows, but those work because they're not trying to fully capture what the character is. They're just borrowing the aesthetic, the attitude, and the surface level traits that can fit into a more controlled environment. But if you're actually trying to adapt Lobo as he exists in the comics, you'd have to lean into all of it. The violence, the imagery, the complete lack of restraint, and at that point, you're making something that already... But if you're actually trying to adapt Lobo as he exists in the comics, you'd have to lean into all of it. The violence.
Like, that picture is what I expect Lobo to look like. Like, man.
It's the imagery, the complete lack of restraint, and at that point, you're making something that already very clearly isn't meant for a general audience, which brings you right back at the core issue. It's not always about whether something can be adapted, it's about whether it can be adapted without losing the thing that made it worth adapting in the first place. And in a lot of those cases, the answer isn't something I very much subscribe to, because sometimes to make it work on screen, you have to change it so much that you're left wondering what the point was to begin with. And other times, you realize that the reason these characters work so well is because they were never meant to leave the page in the first place. But yeah, guys, what do you think? Let me know down below. Who are your favorite characters that will never get a proper end with? And other times, you realize that the reason these characters work so well is because they were never meant to leave the page in the first place. But yeah, guys, what do you think? Let me know down below. Who are your favorite characters that will never get a proper adaptation, or is constantly getting done dirty that you don't have faith in companies adapting them properly? They might be easily adaptable once you have the right writers and the right directors in the room together, but at the moment, it doesn't seem like a possibility. Let me know down below. Remember to like, comment, and
Show love, like you said, like, comment, subscribe. Neatrix Nate, man. Good content. See y'all in a couple seconds, not a couple minutes. Love y'all, man.